Hello, I'm Stephen Matchett from Campus Morning Mail, and this is Expert Opinion, where we ask people who know what is going on in education and research, what's going on. Expert Opinion is brought to you by Twig Marketing, Australia's original HE marketing consultancy. Got a brand issue or a message that isn't getting out? Talk to Tim Winkler, tim@twigmarketing.com. That's one word. And thanks to producer Amanda Johnson from Twig, who makes Expert Opinion happen. Nobody much knows it yet, but yesterday will be remembered down the decades by Australian and New Zealand university librarians because their peak council brought Elsevier to terms on open access. Yes, that Elsevier, the very rich, very powerful for-profit research publisher, which has protected its patch against open access advocates in research agencies, universities and governments for 20 years across Europe, the US and the UK. The financial results of Elsevier's parent, RELX, explain why. Last year, RELX's STM division, which is basically the journals and a mass of increasingly important data analytics subsidiaries, last year it had revenues of just under 4.65 billion, that's billion Australian dollars, and an operating profit of 1 billion. In the last couple of years, CAUL, the Council of Australian University Librarians, has reached agreements with 3 of the other publishing Big Five to make articles in their journals written by ANZ academics at CAUL member universities free to read on publication. And now they are talking to Elsevier, which is a big and important deal indeed. To talk about what was agreed and hopefully what went before, I'm joined by CAUL Director and Monash University Librarian, Bob Gerrity. Thank you for sparing the time, sir. I know how busy you are.
My pleasure, Stephen. Good to be here.
Can I start by asking what has been agreed with Elsevier?
Certainly. So I think, as you're aware, CAUL has for many years negotiated subscription or read agreements with Elsevier on behalf of the sector. So that includes all 39 Australian university libraries, as well as our 8 university library colleagues in New Zealand and a few external members. So we've been dealing with Elsevier for quite a long period of time, typically negotiating 3-year agreements where we attempt to keep the annual increase in those subscription costs at a minimum. But obviously, over the past few years, CAUL has changed focus and begun negotiating with all the major publishers, incorporating publishing rights, so open access publishing entitlements as part of those annual negotiations. Before, up until this year, we had the 15 agreements in place that have been negotiated over the past few years, but not one with Elsevier. So Elsevier has been, until this agreement, a traditional subscription agreement, and a quite significant one. It represents at least double the cost of any of the other agreements. I can't reveal the actual cost of this agreement, but just to give you a sense of the scale across the sector, Australian university libraries spend roughly $275 million a year on journal subscriptions. So it's a pretty hefty sum of money that has been flowing to publishers. And our real strategy now is to begin incorporating as much open access publishing as part of those agreements. So transitioning that large subscription spend to support a transition to open access becoming the default.
Okay. And so now researchers at member institutions will be able to publish open access immediately in how many Elsevier journals?
So this agreement and the so-called read and publish agreements, which are agreements that incorporate the traditional read or subscription access as well as publishing entitlements. Some of them are uncapped, but many of them do have caps. And the Elsevier agreement is a capped agreement, and it covers Elsevier's hybrid journals. So those are journals where that when open access became a thing, subscription journals offered an option to researchers at an article level to pay an additional fee, an article processing charge, to make an article within a paywall journal openly accessible. So creating a separate income stream, if you will, the large volume of funds going through library subscriptions and then additional money going via these article processing charges. So we've really been focusing on hybrid issues first, hybrid journals first. And this agreement with Elsevier covers, at the end of the 3 years, it will cover 100% of expected publishing in Elsevier's roughly 1,800 hybrid journals. But the first 2 years, there is a cap. So for the first year, the article entitlement is 60% of the expected level of publishing in Elsevier hybrid journals. That equates to just under 7,000 papers by Australian researchers that will be able to be published open access. Second year goes up to 80%, so just over 9,000 papers. And in the third year, it will be uncapped. So the deal improves over the course of the agreement. And by the end of the agreement, it will cover all of hybrid. It will not cover the pure gold journals. So the journals where the only option is to pay an article processing charge, although it does offer our members discounts for their researchers to publish in those journals. And it doesn't cover Cell and Lancet titles, which of course are high impact journals that we always have paid separately for.
Okay, the back up one step there.
Yep.
As I understand it, this is in line with the other, 9 agreements Cal's now done over the last 2 or 3 years?
So we have 15 that have been available through this year, and we will be adding, in addition, we've already announced Taylor and Francis and Elsevier, and we have 3 more coming. So we will have a total of 20 agreements at the start of 2023.
Okay. And the deal is that for journals where it applies, researchers will be free to read on publication with no article processing charges, and the cost being made up through subscriptions.
That is correct. So we're transitioning that subscription spend to support open access publishing and eliminating that transactional article processing charge. So the author having the choice of paying a fee when their article is accepted. These are covered.
Okay. Given that you can hear elite scientists complaining, yes, but this does not qualify the Journal of Very Rare and Special Knowledge that I publish in, that has a huge citation rate, et cetera, and I must keep publishing there. Yeah, I can undoubtedly hear that, but nevertheless, this does rather strike me as a concession by all the for-profits over time, and something of a fighting retreat, particularly for Elsevier, which used to dig its heels in. I remember they had a brawl with the University of California that went on for 2 years.
They did, and they had in Germany an actual cancellation that has not been reinstated a few years ago. So German universities canceled their Elsevier subscriptions. But we have seen a shift in the past couple of years, and we have examples from the UK and from Finland, particularly in Europe, where they have been in the past couple of years. National consortia similar to CAL have been successfully negotiating read and publish agreements. I think we have probably the added pressure of the recent US Office of Science and Technology policy, which effectively puts downward pressure on subscription pricing. We, of course, have the recent NHMRC policy change in Australia. So there has been increasing pressure. There's also been change in leadership at Elsevier, and I think a focus now on transitioning over time to an open access model where they have been, as you cite, reluctantly pulled into that arena in some other places. So
yeah, parenthetically, and I shouldn't drill on this, but parenthetically, the next challenge down the track will it be data and data analytics?
Absolutely, and of course that's one of the in addition to accessibility of research data and the importance of that, we have the concerns in the sector with companies like Elsevier, where analytics clearly is becoming a part of their business. And so ensuring that the information they have about our researchers, largely through the accessing their content, remains private and under strong, strict privacy controls.
Have any of the Europeans, I don't think the Americans have, but have any of the Europeans done a similar deal, which driven basically by institutions up, not by government or government agencies?
Yeah, we have seen in Europe a number of national agreements which would be very similar to the call agreement, which have largely been driven by the university or university library sector. And it is very much in line with Plan S. And in Europe, there is a very strong sense that we are transitioning much more rapidly now to open access becoming the default. And the requirement of Plan S that in particular these hybrid journals actually need to transition to fully open access journals.
Did the pandemic do this?
They're following a similar path in terms of transitioning a pretty large subscription spend to enable this transition.
Did the pandemic do this?
I think the pandemic certainly helped us. Which seems a bit ironic given the financial hardship that the pandemic caused, but we were able to pretty clearly articulate to all the publishers that we were operating in a significantly constrained financial environment for our consortial negotiations, and that in terms of the open access agenda, we were bringing to the table essentially the existing subscription spend. Unlike in the UK, for example, there's no ability for us to redirect funds that had been spent by individual researchers on article processing charges. So I think it helped clarify what was possible for us.
I may be missing something, but this surely means that they will take a hit. I have no idea of how big to their revenue models.
Yeah, it's an interesting transition, and obviously, one of the challenges here is obviously scholarly publishing is a global market, but largely arrangements are done at a national and a sector level. And given that most of the publishers are based in the UK or in the US and charge in dollars or US dollars or British pounds, there's been a history of challenging negotiations related to local currency exchange rates, for example. And so agreements over time that are not standard globally. So they reflect the particular history of the company. And so for us, we have these, longstanding arrangements that establish a base of revenue for publishers. And that's highly variable across the globe. What we're able to do is say, we bring a certain possible continuity of revenue for publishers within the Australian context and try to negotiate as many, in this case, publishing rights as possible, trying to enable this transition. But the publisher response is highly, highly variable. So the impact will vary from publisher to publisher.
It is immensely complicated. I mean, it is just immensely complicated. I look at some of the public documents that I can actually, and I don't understand them.
Immensely complicated, and that's one of the things, I think in the press release for the Elsevier agreement, we did indicate we intend to continue negotiating with if you will, with Elsevier during the course of the agreement. One of the challenges in the subscription or read world has been really complex agreements where you've got each member institution subscribing to a different set of titles. And then, so individual subscriptions combined with sort of a database all-you-can-eat model. So we have access to thousands of titles, but we don't actually subscribe to all those titles. And it's a so-called big deal, which all of the journal publishers have been pushing for the last couple of decades. And what we don't want to do is recreate that big deal if we move into OA publishing. And so one of the interesting features because we have this cap with Elsevier, we don't have for the first 2 years access to all of those hybrid titles. So it's a selective list, but it's based on where our researchers historically publish. So it's the journals of interest to our researchers and not the entirety of the hybrid package. So we're beginning to look at a package that's more relevant specifically in the Australian research context.
Is this a model for countries for continents that are relatively powerless in negotiations? I'm thinking of the Hispanic America, of Africa, or countries therein. Is this a model for them?
I think so. We certainly we had capped, some of the previous agreements were capped, and the approach we took was sort of a first come, first serve. And so the entitlement this year has run out for a couple of those large agreements, which is not a good situation. So the approach we've taken with Elsevier and the other publishers this year, if there has to be a cap, if our subscription expenditure can't cover 100% OA, well, then we want to determine which titles are available, and it's going to be based on the publishing history patterns of our researchers. So it is, I don't believe that approach has been widely adopted elsewhere, but I do think it might be relevant in future.
So, I mean, what's next? Where do you go from here? Once you lock up effectively all the commercial publishers, is that a new national model?
Yeah, so I think that is, obviously there are still gaps here. So while some of our agreements cover both hybrid and gold and are uncapped, many of them do not cover the gold journals. And we know publishers like Wiley are pretty actively flipping what are currently hybrid journals and becoming fully gold.
Just tell people what the difference is between those two categories.
So hybrid journals are journals where the publisher still sells subscriptions, so they are behind a paywall, but at an article level, a researcher can pay a fee to make articles within those journals openly accessible. Flipping to OA means they change the business model. They no longer charge subscriptions because everything being published is free to read, and the business model becomes paying to publish, whether it's an individual researcher paying an article processing charge, or they may be covered by these national agreements as a part of a publishing entitlement. So significant shift in the model.
How did you do this? I mean, it's a very, very, very big industry, and it's a very rich and very tough industry. Not so much here, but in the United States, with some political influence. I mean, did Carl just sit down in a room and work out a strategy and then just pursue it over years?
Yeah.
Wow.
So look, I think it was, we have, and there've been longstanding debates. The open access movement goes back 20 years. And there had been a focus on green or repository open access in Australia, which is having the author deposit their accepted manuscript and make that openly available in a repository. Meanwhile, the version of record, so the published version of a paper, would be behind a paywall. We quite deliberately consulted with members a few years ago about changing the strategy, given that while philosophically one could make strong arguments about the benefits of the green approach, over 20 years, we still had 50% of published articles behind a paywall. So it wasn't getting us where we needed to. And really modeled the strategy on Plan S and what seemed to be an emerging successful transition in Europe. And having this longstanding procurement program where Call has negotiated these large subscription agreements on behalf of members gave us a vehicle to execute that strategy. So that's that $275 million a year that university libraries spend in Australia on subscription. That is our lever to execute this strategy, saying, look, we can transition this to support open access, but it will mean some concessions on the part of publishers.
But over 20 years, the basis for green open access has changed dramatically. The technologies are a lot better. The awareness is much higher. Do you think this will be the new normal, or it is just now your new arrangements are the new normal, or are they a stage?
Look, we still think repositories will be relevant, not necessarily for mainstream journal articles, where we do think the version of record is the preferred. Having the version of record immediately OA is the preferred approach. But repositories are still important in terms of supporting bibliodiversity, other types of non-traditional research outputs, for example. But in terms of sort of the mainstream journal article, I believe the approach we've taken, which, as I say, is predominant in Europe now, that will become the normal route. We do see with the recent NHMRC policy, which is neutral, right? Says you can go either the path of agreements like the call agreements or in a gold journal paying an article processing charge.
But you must be open access from day of publication.
But the green route also requires that the accepted manuscript in a repository, for example,
Yep.
be OA from day one. And so the so-called rights retention strategy, which again, in theory is great, but it requires researchers to change their behavior. And it will be challenging, and we're not yet clear on what the publisher response will be in case where it's a researcher wants to publish in a journal not covered by a call agreement. If they attempt to retain rights as prescribed by the NHMRC policy, what the publisher position will be, because typically the publishers do not allow immediate, there's normally an embargo period for green open access.
What about underlying data under your arrangement?
So our agreements at this point are purely covering research articles, not the underlying data. There, CAL also does work around research data management and FAIR, ensuring that research data is findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. But these agreements per se don't incorporate a research data strategy, if you will.
What do you say to open access advocates who believe that this is knowledge that belongs to the public and it should be available to the public, straight up?
Completely agree. I guess as a pragmatist. So, early in my career, at around the time of the launch of open access, I was a very strong advocate of repositories. And at a previous institution in the US, started up the first repository. But that approach alone won't get us where we need to go. So I think a combination of strategies really is what works. And from a pragmatic point of view, CAL is simply trying to work with one of the big levers that we have to progress that transition to OA.
Does your community quite understand what you've pulled off yet?
Good question. I think certainly the members, these agreements have really, I think, energized the conversation between our members. So the university libraries at their institution about open access. And from a researcher's point of view, by and large, in my experience, most of them don't have a philosophical leaning. They might in theory say, sure, of course, things should be openly accessible, but don't follow the ins and outs of how the open access movement has progressed. But when faced with a funder mandate or an opportunity to make their research openly available, but having to pay a transactional fee, this offers them a route to OA that's really, really easy to take advantage of. And we're finding they're really appreciative of that. And university administration, we can demonstrate cost avoidance for these agreements that's actually pretty significant in terms of avoidance of those transactional APCs. And
almost all your deals were done before the NHMRC at least was public on what it wanted to do. And as far as I know, the ARC is not doing anything.
Yep. So I have no particular insight into where ARC may be going, but yes, these were done before the shift.
Would it help if would it help in future stages if government took a stance?
Oh, I think it would. And obviously, CAL has been involved in the chief scientist's consultations around her idea of a national approach to open access, which of course we're supportive of. And we think that these agreements actually can fit into that framework quite nicely.
Okay. Bob Gerrity, thank you so much for spending the time. I know you're busy, you've got other things to do, but it's a big day for librarians.
Thanks, Stephen. It is.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I hope we talk again soon.
Great,
thanks for listening. It's Expert Opinion. Stephen Matchett from Campus Morning Mail, and we're out.